Ooh.
Okay, we're live. This is very exciting. Welcome. If you're joining us already, you'll be the first person to join us. We are. This is a live conversation with some experts in fresh expressions, and we're going to be talking about rewilding the church today. So if you're joining us, what we'd really love you to do is to join in the conversation. So it's not just the four of us, or really the three experts. I'm just kind of monitoring the conversation. So do say hi, do write your questions in the box, and we will try to get to some of them. It seemed like it was surprisingly popular, like the advert. So we've no idea how many people are going to join us, but we've already got some people saying hi, which is fantastic. Just before we kick off, just to introduce ourselves, my name's Lizzie. I work for Fresh Expressions, and I'm based in Liverpool, and I'm also a lay pioneer running a project called Story House. That's a coffee shop and a fresh expression of church. And I'm just going to go round and get the guys to introduce themselves. So Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Aisthorpe, and I work for Church of Scotland. I'm based in the Highlands near Aviemore in the Cairngorms, and I work as a mission development worker. I've been doing that for quite a few years, and my work is changing at the moment, becoming more involved with pioneering fresh expressions.
Amazing. Oh no, it's great to have you with us, and fantastic, like well done on the book. And I love the book cover as well, because I think that's quite important. So it's great to talk about your book today. And then we've got Adam and Pete. Adam, can you introduce yourself? Like, where are you based? What is your involvement in Fresh Expressions?
Hi, so I'm based in Lincoln, or just outside Lincoln. I'm a freelance archaeologist, but I also help to lead the church that Pete leads. And I guess my involvement with Fresh Expressions is sort of through the work that Pete's doing locally in Threshold and Lincolnshire and beyond.
Brilliant. Oh, that's fantastic. So Pete, you're obviously also in Lincolnshire. Have you been involved in Fresh Expressions for a long time?
Yeah, in two ways really. So Kath, my wife, and I, we planted the church that Adam and I lead together way back in 1995. More classical in those days, I guess. And then we joined Fresh Expressions, the national team, then in 2006, really to help roll out a course called Mission Shaped Ministry across the UK and further afield, but to help people start pioneering and start Fresh Expressions of church. And then we've always felt really called to rural areas particularly. And 10 years ago, we moved to where we are now, which was a village that was new to us, and started pioneering here. And a community has developed here by the grace of God. And in the church we began those years ago, which Adam and I and our wives both involved in, I guess we've got about 9 or 10 teams in different villages, starting new ways of doing church. Pioneering in different ways, very contextually, but mostly all, there's an occasional accident, rural.
Yeah, that's amazing, because you're also part of the FX the rural guiding team as well, aren't you? Yeah. So it's like a group of kind of Fresh Expressions practitioners across the country who are experts in rural ministry. So you'll be, so it's great. Yeah, Pete's got a lot of wisdom, and the guiding team have got great plans for the next year or so that we'll be telling you about, things you can get involved in. Welcome to the conversation if you just joined us, or if maybe you're watching later, thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions as we're chatting, do put them in the comments, and we will try to address them and answer some of them. So hopefully it's kind of a conversation that we're having outside of the four of us. So to start with, I think a really important question that we need to really clarify is, Steve, could you kind of give us a summary of what rewilding means, and like where the idea came from?
Okay, so rewilding is an idea in ecology and environmentalism, and it's about the idea of letting nature itself be in the driving seat. So, biologists would tell us that all living things have what they call biotic potential. That means they've got this kind of innate capacity to grow, to regenerate. And rewilding enthusiasts say, rather than doing conservation, that is often about preserving what are basically man-made environments or environments that are shaped by human intervention, we should let this biotic potential loose, and what comes out of it, what emerges, is the real deal, authentic landscape.
Amazing. Yeah, it sounds where did the idea for the book come from? So you've got this kind of idea of rewilding. How did that come about?
Yeah, so 4 years ago, I was just finishing writing a different book, this book here called The Invisible Church. And that was a book about research I'd been doing amongst Christians who were not engaged in a church congregation in the traditional sense. So I'd been doing this research, trying to kind of look behind the statistics, if you like, trying to listen to the stories of people. And I was writing the last chapter of that book. And in the last chapter, I was trying to kind of look ahead, trying to look to the future. And I was praying and asking God, saying, if we kind of look at the trajectories within the church, where is this taking us? And at the same time I was doing that, I was part of a book club in the village where I live. And we were reading a book called Feral by George Monbiot. And it's a book about rewilding as an environmental idea. And I just couldn't get it out of my head, the kind of the parallels between what I was reading on the one hand and what I was trying to write on the other hand. And I became convinced, I guess, that what I was seeing as I was trying to discern the future was that God is rewilding the church. And there were so many kind of parallels between one and the other. And so I started thinking about it. And, over the last 3 or 4 years, it's been a very tough journey, actually. I've nearly given up on it lots of times. But I couldn't give it up. And whenever I did give it up, somebody came along, and Adam and Pete were amongst them, people who I didn't know, but somehow we crossed each other's paths, and people said, oh, this is important. You need to keep going with this. So that's how we ended up with the book eventually.
Amazing. Yeah, like I've written a book, and it can be quite painful sometimes, the process of writing it. But yeah, it just shows that real sense that obviously God's speaking to a lot of people about this idea of rewilding and the importance that it could have in the future of the church. And so, yeah, Pete and Adam, it'd be really great to kind of hear from you guys. So Adam, like, what is it about rewilding that's kind of inspired you or captured you or whatever that is that's got you interested in it? What is it about it?
Yeah, it's the life that it brings. It all started with me a couple of years ago. I've got a garden that's really quite long, and down the far end of it, it's not overlooked by anyone. So I thought one day, I'm a curious sort of person, thought, well, I'll just take my hands off it and let it go wild and just see what happens. And anyway, the next year, there was all sorts of plants, all sorts of flowers, all sorts of wildlife there, which I'd never seen before, which I'd never planted. And it was beautiful. It was mess, but it was beautiful, and it was attracting all sorts of bugs and beetles. And a bit like Steve, I sort of looked at it and thought, there's parallels here for the church, and it's the life that it brings. And it's sort of a paradox, isn't it, that by letting go, all of this life flourishes. And so Pete was on holiday at the time, and I emailed him and got all excited, and then did a video about it, and then bumped into Steve, and it just feels like God's speaking.
Yeah, definitely. That's really beautiful. And like in your book, Steve, you talk about there was this place, it was in Kent, wasn't it? This big estate that you mentioned, and how they let the land kind of do its own thing, and then what came out was amazing. And the noise of like the insects and the life that kind of came out of having left it to its own devices, which
yeah. So you're talking about the Nepa State, and I think At one of the other times when I was going to give up on this book, Paul Bradbury, who some people on here may know, wrote a blog post, and he'd been reading the book that the person who headed up that NEP project had written. Somebody called Isabella Tree wrote a book called Wilding. And so he, again, independently was reflecting on these ideas. And I think that's one of the exciting things. You know, I'm still coming across people every day at the moment who've been having similar thoughts. And I'm up here in the Highlands, kind of quite isolated in many ways, you know, not part of lots of church networks and things particularly. And so it's been so encouraging to stumble on people who've read the same stuff, had the same ideas, and God has been stirring their hearts in the same kinds of ways.
Amazing. Yeah. And so Pete, for you, like what has kind of captured you about this idea of rewilding?
It's given me a kind of a framework, a metaphor, I think, to think about what we're already doing and understand maybe how to do it better still. So I first came across the phrase from George Lings, who was at our rural conference last year. And it was just a throwaway phrase in something he was talking about. And I just lodged in my head. And I thought, I wonder what he means by that. And then, like Steve, I came across Paul Bradbury's blog from CMS. And then I was having a holiday, and Adam emailed me and said, what about, why don't we rewild the church, you know? And I thought, yeah, absolutely, that's what we're doing. Because we've been practicing some time a sense of taking our hands off and encouraging people where they live, particularly in rural areas, to just follow the Spirit, really, to see what it is he's calling them to cooperate with, to listen to him, to follow him. And all these different kind of varieties of pretty contextual church have arisen, really, as a result. And our role is mostly to say, yeah, great, go for it, encourage, pray, coach, connect, that kind of stuff. Take our, you know, not sort of shape it according to the vision or whatever, but encourage them to seek their own vision and support them in it, really, and see what develops. Because that's one of the things about wilding. You don't know what's going to happen until you let it go. And so it's not a predictable process. It's not what we usually like in church leaders. It's much more a kind of a trusting God with the outcome of what we're beginning, but being prepared to support and get behind people, even if it seems to go wrong and creates the inevitably messy bit initially.
Yeah. I think that's such a great description of the kind of Fresh Expressions process, as well as that listening and seeing where God is at work. It's a very different approach to other kind of ways of doing mission in church. And there's that participation in what God's doing, not kind of going in with our own plans, which works really well. As we're talking a bit more about church, I don't know if you guys have got any thoughts, like just trying to kind of create a bit more of a structure as we go into the conversation. What do you think are the main, this is a big question, like the main challenges, like as we're trying to take this idea of rewilding into looking at the church, because we'll go into different platform, different kind of contexts, but where do you think, what are the lessons, Steve, that you would say the kind of big lessons that maybe come out as we look at church through the lens of rewilding? That maybe, I don't know, it's kind of, you've got different chapters in your book, obviously, that look at different aspects with it. Like, that's a big question, but a kind of any.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, though. I mean, first of all, I would say at the heart of it is this idea that just as I described nature having this kind of innate capacity for growth and regeneration, there's the parallel with the heart of the church. And when I say the heart of the church, I'm talking about the power at its core, if you like. I think of Paul, who talks about the immeasurably great power, the same power that rose Jesus from the dead. That is the power that's at the heart of the church. So that's the very core of the idea, I guess. And then, when you talk about the main ideas, I almost hesitate a little bit, because one thing I learned in the process of writing the book is not to predict what other people are going to take from using this metaphor. So in one of the earlier drafts of the book, every chapter had little text boxes which had questions and points for discussion and little prayers and reflections and things. And I realized at some point, whoa, wait a minute, here I'm at it again. Here's me trying to control what a reader is going to take away from this book, whereas actually what I want to be doing is inviting them to pray and reflect and take what God is saying to them. So actually we ripped out all those text boxes, and now as you read through the text, you're just encouraged at different points, stop, pause, reflect. What might God be saying to you, in your context about this? Because as Adam said too, or was it Pete? One of them anyway. It's unpredictable. We don't know the outcome. And that's why some people actually prefer the term wilding to rewilding, because, rewilding may suggest you're trying to go back to something that previously existed. And it's not about that at all. So yeah, there's different chapters, and we can talk about those different themes, different ideas, if you like. But I think we do need to really kind of hold back and let people see what God's saying to them through this.
No, it's fantastic. I love the kind of Selah, kind of stop, pause moments in at different points in the book, because often we can just consume information and not really reflect on kind of what's going on in our hearts and what's God's trying to say. So I think I think we need to put it in, because we forget to do that so often. So I think it's a great quality of the book. We've got a few questions. I think they kind of lead into each other, but we'll see. But we've got Lucy Moore, who is an amazing pioneer, Messy Church founder, wonderful lady. She's got a question here. Could you talk about pioneer species as a metaphor, please? Anyone fancy taking that?
I'll start. Yeah, one of the things that I think is key to wilding or rewilding is the introduction of certain species that really make a big difference. So Steve talks in the book about the wolves in Yellowstone and beavers in Scotland and other things, which I think is a great way of looking at some things we need now in the life of the church. And for me, the particular species that have been missing have been the apostolic and the prophetic types, really. And they are very much needed as part of the fivefold ministries Paul talks about in Ephesians 4. They just restore a balance to the way the church should be. And the prophets, we need them to help lead us ahead, those with prophetic tendencies, all different kinds, all different cultures. Some wouldn't think they were prophetic at all, but we do need to hear their voices. And also the apostolic types, which I think some aspects of pioneering are very like. So they're breakthrough people who blaze trails where there have been no trails, people who start things, initiate things, think out the box, entrepreneurial, stir things up, make things happen. And often they're those who have a wisdom about where everybody else fits in. They're good usually at gathering, at starting, at that kind of thing. And I think for me, one of the things that works in this metaphor is that the apostolic and the prophetic, as represented in some pioneers that we know, many, I guess, are part of what God is doing in reintroducing into the mix of gifting in the church species that have been missing for a while. I think teachers and pastors are much more controllable.
Yeah.
Stirring it up a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I can maybe pick up on that a wee bit, because Pete, you used the word missing. Some kinds of people are maybe missing from parts of the church, and that's maybe one of the links between my previous work with the Invisible Church and this current rewilding idea, is that there are certain groups of people who are missing from many of our church communities, institutions, etc. And over the years that I've been writing Rewilding the Church, I've also been continuing my research with people who are disengaged from church. And one of the things we've discovered by using tools like, personality types and religious orientation, things like that, is that we find those who are Christians outside of church institutions, there are certain types that are overrepresented amongst them. And conversely, within our church institutions, there are other types that are overrepresented. And one of the types that is largely missing in institutional expressions of church, let's say, are what we would, in terms of psychological type, we would call them thinkers. In terms of religious orientation, we would talk about quest. So these are people for whom asking questions and exploring doubt is fundamental to their faith. It's right at the heart of it. And generally, our church institutions become more and more similar over time. That's something that's kind of explored in the Invisible Church a bit. It's not unique to churches. It's the same in any kind of community. If certain kinds of people dominate, then those who are not part of that group or think differently or act differently will become more and more marginalized and fall off the edges. So amongst the people who are committed Christians, but not generally part of church congregations, there are a lot of people who, Lucy, you used the term pioneer species. I think there's quite an overlap with that term and some of the things I'm talking about in terms of psychological type as well. It's about a particular kind of aptitude. I have certainly encountered an overrepresentation of pioneering species amongst the folk I've interviewed who have disengaged from church in the traditional sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. We found with our Fresh Expression, the people who become Christians, we were asking them what, they weren't engaging with church. So it was like, well, what is it that you would like from church? Like what kind of church would you like? And they wanted somewhere where they could ask questions, where they could bring their doubts. And the kind of the way that the church in the area had been set up, there was no space for that and no space for dialogue. And so I think that's really important. This is kind of following on Tim. Lovely photo, Tim. Looking good.
Tell you that worse than usual.
Tim's a pioneer. I think he's in Norfolk, and he's been pioneering a long time. But he's like, what are the missing species in our Western church ecology? Kind of following on. Adam, any thoughts? Yeah, we've not heard from you for a while.
Yeah. Well, this is a really interesting question because it relates to the one previous. I was going to say that if I can sort of relate this to what we're trying to do on the ground with our households and with our community groups, it's about equipping everyone to realise that each and every one of them is a pioneer, that each and every one of them has the giftings and the skills to do this. We're all called to spread the good news, the gospel, whether it's at the school gate when we're picking up our kids, whether it's doing your shopping run, whatever your local context is, it's saying to people, actually, you're it. You are a pioneer in your own cultural context. So if we think about what's missing, I'm not sure that there are actually any species missing. I think they're all here. It's just about convincing them that you are a goat or you are a pigeon. It's about bringing those gifts and those skills out of people and releasing them into their context.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. We've got a question from Ali Dory, who is part of the Fresh Expressions leadership community, and which Pete is a part of as well, now that Fresh Expressions has moved into becoming a movement. So Ali works with New Housing as a pioneer, and she's got a question here. Do we risk losing something important about literal environmental rewilding as we apply the idea symbolically to the church? Is there a way of encouraging both? Would anyone like to kind of kick off responding?
Yeah, gosh, that's a really interesting question, because I think one of the reasons why this metaphor has a kind of such a resonance is because we are living in a time of environmental crisis and church crisis, and it speaks to both. And I think I was very conscious right in the book that I was in danger of alienating people who were not bought into the environmental arguments for rewilding. I live in a very rural area. I'm surrounded by sporting estates and farmers and conservation groups, and the debates about rewilding kind of rage around me here. And I think the key arguments within those debates have got something to say to the church. But we do have to be a bit careful about kind of aligning the two things, in that you cannot be bought into the environmental arguments for rewilding, but still find some really compelling and life-giving stuff for church. And perhaps vice versa, who knows? I don't know. But yeah, it is a metaphor. I mean, I think it was Pete who started off saying, this is a metaphor. And, the great thing about metaphors are they engage our imagination. They kind of provide a lens. What was familiar can be cast in a new light and things. But it is a very particular kind of metaphor. The fact it's an environmental metaphor means that it's rooted in something that we are part of. And if we think about the scriptures, the Old Testament, that the relationship between the land and the people and God, is fundamental in the Old Testament. And then as we go into the Gospels, Jesus again and again points to nature, points to the birds, the lilies of the field, etc. So it's not any old metaphor. It's a particularly powerful one, but it's also one we maybe need to handle with care, I guess, when we're talking particularly in rural environments where people's livelihood is deeply embedded in the environment.
Yeah. That's really helpful.
I think pursuing rewilding the church, or wilding the church as a metaphor, handled rightly, and I'm really grateful for Steve and the way he's written the book, really, but handled rightly should do nothing but enhance the engagement of Christians with the natural environment. That's not primarily what this conversation is about, but in answer to Ali, this is Ali Dorey, by the way. She used to be Director of Training for Fresh Expressions, not Ali Bolton, who heads up the new housing thing.
Oh, sorry, I got the wrong person.
Right, no, there's lots of Alis. They're all wonderful. This I used to work closely with this Ali, and basically, I think, Ali, it will really help the environmental engagement of Christians. And I've got to say that because my brother works for Russia UK. Otherwise, I'm in trouble. But I talked to him about rewilding the church, and he's talking to me about rewilding full stop. It's a great conversation. You can learn a lot. And I think it should do nothing but good for our engagement with that fifth mark of mission, which I know you're very familiar with.
Yeah, amazing. Well, no, thank you so much for that. We've got loads of questions. I think this is a brilliant one from Richard, because we're not in usual times. Like, we have just come through something extraordinary that will be talked about for the rest of time. Richard, so where nature has thrived in many ways, especially earlier during lockdown, do you think that lockdown has been a vital catalyst for rethinking and exploring how we do church? Oh my goodness, Richard, yes. Would anyone like to go?
Yeah, start with Adam, because he's living with this stuff.
Do you know, I've loved there's been some real good moments on the news since lockdown. I mean, most of it's been pretty harrowing, but I've loved these little videos where you see like dolphins swimming up to ports that have, sort of the traffic's gone quieter, and we've seen sort of bears wandering into villages and herds of deer, things like that taking over towns. And it's been really amusing to kind of see, in this time, kind of wildlife doing its thing, where humans have taken their hands off. And since lockdown, we've really been thinking about this in Threshold. What does this actually look like? We love talking about pictures and metaphors, but we do get to that point where we have to say, well, what does it look like? I think what we'll come to is it looks like lots and lots of different things. It looks like very contextual forms of church, and it is accelerating all of this process. I mean, we've been thinking lots about our gatherings as sort of big church, which used to be Sunday mornings, but now we're online and we're, looking at multiple different types of gatherings at different times. But what's coming into focus is, how do we live in our households? and how do we live in our smaller communities, and how do we interact, with our neighbours, with the people that we're perhaps bubbling with or we're doing life with, and I think all of this is causing everyone to think very much about their role as discipling their own children, for example. Kids can't get to sort of wider church, so parents are now taking on that. Parents are now chatting more and more with people across their fence and just sharing the good news and sharing life. And I think all of this is just a very, very first green shoots of this thing called rewilding. And I don't think we're seeing any of it in any sort of developed form at the moment, certainly not in Threshold where we are, but we are seeing loads and loads of green shoots, some really good stories happening, some real beginnings of communities forming where people are doing life. They're inviting people round a campfire. They're just sharing their life, their stories, their adventures, their fears, their hopes, and just talking about Jesus and letting people see what does faith actually look like in my ordinary, everyday village, street, hearth, home life. And it's beautiful. And I don't think we can predict where any of our communities are going to end up this time next year. And we don't need to. We just need to keep praying that God blesses them, fills them with the Holy Spirit every day, gives them the equipping, the tools, the conversations, the contacts, and just let them go. Be there for them, guide them, support them, equip them, but just encourage them. Just go for it. You're it.
Yeah, that's so fantastic. I think there's been I know a lot of church leaders, us as well, there was so much pressure to kind of work out how do we respond to this and to kind of move quickly and respond quickly, and then everything kept changing all the time, and now obviously things have calmed down, but church still can't gather in the way it used to. But I think there's a real courage that's needed to not rush into trying to go back. And we've kind of seen that already, that there's such a huge draw to go back to what we knew and how we did things. And would you I don't know, what would you say? Do you think we've missed the moment as a church, or do you think there's still time to kind of explore the world? There was this huge critical moment, and it feels like maybe there was so much potential and we may have slightly lost the energy. What do you think? Do you think we've lost it, or do you think there's still time? We're still in that moment?
I don't think we've lost it, but we're in danger of losing it. And I think you said something really important there, Lizzie, about courage. And going back to the rewilding metaphor again, you mentioned that Nepa State down in the south of England. Mm. They were fighting a losing battle in terms of intensive agriculture. And they took the monumental decision to rip up the fencing, to stop chasing their tails with that, and to see what happened in terms of rewilding. But what happened first looked like an environmental disaster. The ground was just covered with thistles and nettles, and nothing like what it's become many years later. And it took real courage to hold their nerve and to see what nature would do given time and space. And I think at the moment we're at a time when we need patience and courage, because we shouldn't underestimate the powerful default mindset of save the church. I talked about we're in a time of environmental crisis and church crisis. Somebody said, who was it? Some Dutch theologian, Kramer, said the church is always in crisis, but its greatest shortcoming is that it's only occasionally aware of it. And I think we're at a time in that we're aware of it, but there's a danger of misdiagnosis. That people think the crisis is that there's nobody sitting in pews on a Sunday morning. That is not the crisis. So yeah, we do need to be patient, and we need to listen. I mean, something else you touched on as well, Lizzie, about listening and acting. I mean, I think at the heart of this whole rewilding thing is being patient in listening and courageous in action. So we listen to discern what God wants us to do, and we step out in faith and courage and do it. And that can sound like a big deal, but I think what it's like for most people most of the time is what Adam's described. It's about faithfulness in the context we find ourselves in the day-to-day, in our households, in our neighborhoods, etc.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. Pete, have you got anything you want to add to that? Or
yeah, I think we are still in the moment. I think there are some signs of people wanting to return too quickly to what was, rather than using the opportunity to move on to something new. I have a friend that I speak to regularly in Norway who's really upset that lockdown lasted a very short time there, and the churches have gone back to exactly how they were before we started. But I think we're still in the moment, and I think one of the reasons we wanted this conversation was just a conversation with lots of people, just to say we think that there's something in this metaphor, there's something in pioneering which relates closely to it, which we can offer the church at this time as a way of crafting, under God, a new future for the church. There is a way of looking at this which will help us at every level, whether it's individuals or churches or regions or dioceses or districts or whatever. It works at all those levels, I think. And it's a moment when it needs serious consideration. It really does. Why go back to what is not working? Why try and hunker down back into the institutions, the structures, the hierarchy, the bullet points, the strategies, the rushed meetings in London? It's just not what Jesus created. It's so different. And why don't we move on to what is relational primarily, what is full of the gifts of the Spirit and the various ministries that he brings, which is a connectedness and a life and a diversity? Why not move on to something which is an adventure with him, because we cannot predict what it will end up like. But listening to the Holy Spirit, each of us and all of us together in our churches, prepared to take the adventure and see what happens. That's what's needed right now. And as Steve has really well said, it's about courage, listening, patience at all those different levels, not just individuals, but churches, regions, big organizations need to sit back and think, okay, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for us?
Yeah, amazing. Adam, do you find that easy to let go and see, to kind of that patience, to kind of see where God is at work? Is that something that's come naturally to you, or is it something you've had to work at?
Well, I don't know. I've not been doing this long. I suppose I'm naturally quite laid back and quite trusting of people. But I think in everyone there's an element of control that we need to give up. I think in this next season, a lot of things are going to come into focus that we need to move away from, move out from. And I think if we just look at Jesus's model of on the road discipleship, and that's the best place to start. And just trust people and just encourage them, equip them, pray for them, do it in team. It's so important that we are in this together. And one of the ways that we kind of managed to tell the story among our church is we had one Sunday where we went out actually to a local park where there was a load of farmland that was donated years ago, and it was rewilded essentially. So we went out as a whole church and we just we prayed and we walked around and just said, so what do you see? What do you physically see? What do you smell? What do you hear? And then we were just chatting and just asking God to show us pictures and parallels, and it was great. Everyone just was throwing in conversations, and it's about going on this journey together as a church community, as a network of friends. I think the longer this goes on and the more mess that sort of grows up around, I think it probably become even more challenging to sort of have that hands-off approach. But it's you just need the right people around you, I think.
Yeah,
there's a key to it, I think, which is in Steve's book on his chapter on listening, which I think is really, really, really important, and to allow the Holy Spirit to lead us because we are listening. And that's different for every person. People listen to God in different ways, and different communities do it different ways. It does put a premium, I think, on the prophetic at this time and all kinds of what that may look like. But I think each group of friends, each individual, each church culture needs to build into their culture a way of just listening to God and taking the steps that they believe he's asking them to do. If we're not led by the Holy Spirit, we're not going to go anywhere fruitful. We've got to do that at every level and build it in the way we know where we are. So all of us listening today, how do we encourage those around us to listen to God faithfully? You know, sometimes it can take years before you really know what he's asking of you in a particular situation. Sometimes it can be very spontaneous. So again, I'm not going into a sermon on listening to God, but I just think that chapter is a really key chapter for me, and the whole thing, it's a key to much of this.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I think like a lot of pioneers can be activists, and so there is this kind of sense of wanting to create something new and be part of something new. But the listening, like I know for me, I know I need to listen, but you always need to spend longer than you think in that space, and it's kind of trusting the process. And it does take a lot of courage to kind of to go slower at the beginning, but it is so important, and it's such a key part of pioneering. We've had online conversations over the past few months during lockdown with practitioners across the country that have been really brilliant, and kind of just talking about like what are we sensing the Spirit is saying in this season. And it was kind of stop, listen, wait, like that came out again and again every month. And I think you're like, oh, I did that in June, but it's like, no, it's the same thing. It's just, you can't just spend like 4 weeks in lockdown listening. Like we're still in that moment, but there is a real courage. There's so many questions, and we're not going to be able to answer them all, but they're all fantastic. And I don't know the answer to them, and these guys do. But there's quite an interesting one here from Paul. It's almost hiding Steve and Adam. It's such a big question. There's nothing new under the sun, Steve. I'm sure I've read that somewhere. I've only just started the book, but are there precedents in history of the church for the kind of thing you're outlining? So we think we're in a new era and no one's done this before, but that's never true, is it?
Okay, we are in a new era. We are doing something that nobody's done before, but you're absolutely right. There's nothing new under the sun. You know, both are true, aren't they? You know, so we were just talking about listening. When we listen, we don't know what we're going to hear. Who knows? Might be old, might be new. It'll be new in a sense because it'll be fresh. But is it an old thing, a new thing? Well, we don't know. If we knew that, then we don't need to sit down and listen. And if we think we already know that, then actually, our heart's not really in this. We're not really seeking God's answer. We've already got our own ideas. And in a sense, the concepts at the heart of rewilding the church, you're right, go absolutely right back to the beginning. I think when Jesus said, look at the birds of the air, look at the lilies of the field, there's the beginning of it right there. And from what I understand of the actual language that he used there, that we read in the Gospels, it means take a really good look at these things. Study these things. So don't just glance at these things, but really look at them and see what is God saying through these things. So is it a new thing? Yes, and absolutely not. I don't think we've stumbled on something new in a sense, but we are rediscovering something. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between traditions and traditionalism. So tradition, it has been called the living faith of the dead. It's the good stuff. It's that at the heart of our faith that's passed on from one generation to the next. And you can look back through the history of the church, and there are these key traditions. And I'm not talking about, how we do communion or, how we lay out this or that. I'm talking about the kind of the essences, if you like, of being church, So Richard Foster talks about 6 traditions. You have a contemplative, the holiness tradition, incarnational, the evangelical, social justice, and the one I've forgotten, charismatic. Did I say that? Anyway, you get the idea. It's those kind of underlying rivers in the history of the church. And one of the things I believe that we've been challenged about at the moment is kind of putting our roots down back into some of those deep traditions. And that's in contrast to traditionalism, which is all about anchoring ourselves in the past or anchoring ourselves in the present, not changing things. But, generally, in terms of those big traditions, we've tended over history to major on 1 or 2 of them and neglect the others. But they're all of God. They're all kind of underlying his church, if you like. And one of the things about the environmental rewilding is that in cities around the world, including in the UK, they're kind of ripping up concrete that we've put rivers under in our towns and cities. So in Sheffield now, so I wonder if there's anybody with us this afternoon from Sheffield. I think it's called Potter's Brook, is it? Potter's Brook there, that used to be under a culvert, and they've opened it up. And now there's fish there, and it's a beautiful place. And the whole environment around there is much better for it. And it's had a social impact too. So they call it daylighting, kind of opening up these deep rivers that have been long buried. And I think that's part of it too. So rediscovering the most ancient, if you like, but through some new emphases, perhaps.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
I don't think I answered his question, but
it sounded great.
That's what came to mind.
I think it relates to the difference between wilding and rewilding, in the sense that if you're rewilding, you have to kind of make a decision about how far back you're going to go when you think things were like you're trying to recreate. So if it's beavers, you're going back 400 years when they were last sort of not extinct in the UK, or do you go back to like several thousand years ago where there were still rhinoceroses, elephants and tigers in the UK, etc. So one of the beauties about the wilding thing, or rewilding with the church, is that time and time again, people go back to the book of Acts, particularly Acts chapter 2. And I think many church renewal movements over the years have kind of said, well, we read Acts 2 again. We had a look back at that, and it's not a blueprint. It's not supposed to be used like that, I know. But there's a life about the church when it first began, which we do well to consider, I think, when we're thinking if we want to rewild as well as go ahead into God's unknown future, some of the keys to that will be as what we see when the church was birthed.
Yeah, a lot of people have talked about that, like similar as Adam was talking about, church becoming smaller in a sense in our homes because we haven't been able to meet in big groups. Exactly. That's how the early church started. A lot of people, and people are talking about kind of going back to that, and that's something we're thinking about, is rather than try and fight what we can't do, is rethinking what does discipleship look like. If we're called to make disciples, how do we do that in this moment? And also, it shouldn't be this kind of passive, like let the kind of the leader do everything for you. It's equipping disciples. And so surely this is a fantastic moment to equip them, to equip families. You can't do kids work, like equip the families to disciple their kids. Like this is that letting go, which is so hard. We've got Anderson, loving Adam's tiny light. Just thought I had to give. It's a very cool setup that Adam's got there. I'm
trying to escape the family to get some peace and quiet, so I can do this whole. It's much brighter than
it looks. Very cool. Something we talked about before we came on air live, with the way rewilding can work at different levels. And you do mention that in your book, Steve. And Andy Wilson's got a question that I think hopefully we'll kind of tie in with this as we kind of move the conversation on, saying, why do we need to spend longer listening? Do we not recognize God's voice? Which is I think that's really interesting. Any thoughts?
I'm guessing he's a prophet. I'm sorry, that's only half joking. Actually, people obviously find people are very different in how easy they feel it is to hear God's voice. And I guess what we're learning is that we need to encourage individuals to do it in their own context of their own relationship with God, but also, as Adam said earlier, do it as a community. I think there's some more certainty if you're trying to hear God together. And for some, it takes a while, and for some communities, it takes a while. But sometimes you get like a lightning bolt, where you get everybody suddenly reads the same scripture the same day by accident, and God's clearly saying something, or whatever it is, So I think it's a bit of a spectrum, really, about how easily people hear God's voice.
Yeah.
Can I go back one step? Can I be very naughty, Lizzie? I want to quote from Steve's book, if I may.
Yes, you may.
Page just to round off the thing about small groups. I think it's really helpful.
It's not a spelling mistake, is it?
No, it's really good. It's really good. It says, an important aspect of God's rewilding of the church is reflected in the emergence of many small groups of pilgriming friends, creating habitats where those unable to thrive in traditional congregations can flourish. However, the church will be enriched when we notice our differences, celebrate our diversity, and build connections of mutual learning and sharing, which I think answers a lot of the questions on the screen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, read the book. Really, that's the it's a fantastic quote. How do you think this relates to our personal relationship with God? So we've talked a bit about the church. What do you guys think about that?
Gosh, so I mentioned at the beginning, Lizzie, that I'd found this quite a challenge to write this book. I mean, it really has been a battle, I would say. And part of the reason for that battle is because I realized that when I started writing it, I couldn't write it with integrity. That actually I needed to be wholehearted in my willingness to be rewilded, as I attempted to kind of explore what that might mean for other people and for the church, etc. Not that we ever become rewilded, it's an ongoing process, obviously, but I felt personally challenged about my own willingness to kind of let go, if you like, and to do the kind of stuff I was writing about. So what was the question again? On a personal level, yeah. So I know it's been a very personal journey for me, and like you say, I think I've tried to write the book in such a way that it definitely applies on different levels, because I started off with the idea that actually God is rewilding the church. I'm convinced of that, but then you come back to, okay, if that is the case, what does that mean for me? And what does it mean for the particular Christian community I'm part of? So we've often said mission is about finding out what God is doing and joining in. Well, rewilding the church is about discerning what God is doing and allowing him to do it in me too.
We've been working, Steve, on we being Adam and I in this case, on it's come out as a series of questions that we might ask ourselves if we're serious about being wilded as individual Christians. And as I read through your book again this last few days, fascinating to see how resonant much of what you said can really be built into those questions. So a few questions, for example, that individuals might ask themselves if they want to be rewilded is, okay, if I'm going to move ahead in this area, what baggage do I need to leave behind? What treasures do I take with me? In other words, if I'm going to travel light, what does that then look like for what I've brought with me over the years? Second question could be, am I really prepared to follow Jesus and sacrifice all for him? Is it really, am I really prepared to go to areas I've never been before, which is well out of my comfort zone, and go there with whoever he says I'm to go there with? What does my life look like in terms of compassion towards others, towards the broken and the needy, the hurting, the poor? Am I doing life in the rhythm of prayer where I'm regularly, intentionally listening to God? Am I doing life with others around a campfire? Am I attending events, or am I doing life in community? So we've tried to identify. We've come up with 7 questions so far, I think, Adam, haven't we? And we're going to kind of, as a church, work our way through those over the coming season, because I think it's really important that individuals know how they can be, the truth can set them free, how they can become blowable by the Holy Spirit, excuse the grammar, if Jesus's metaphor in John 3, the wind blows where it will, and so it is with anyone born of the Spirit. Okay, what does that really look like? Am I really prepared to be blown to wherever God wants me to be and do what, and germinate or do whatever there? So I think there are many things which are going to come out of this, but one of them, I think, is how do you apply this to an individual? And for me at the moment, it means a series of questions we seriously apply to ourselves, but do it in the company of those we trust and people who around us who love us.
Amazing. That's brilliant.
Yeah, I think there's a song in this, isn't there? That Lord send rewilding, start with me.
That's interesting. There's a song that came to mind for me as you were saying that, Pete, was "Take My Life and Let It Be."
Oh, yeah.
And
okay.
do you know it goes through all those different verses, and I don't know how many verses there are, but each verse, in a sense, is that kind of question.
Yes.
And also an affirmation. Yes, Lord, let it happen in me.
Absolutely. She wrote the song out of an experience. Frances Havergal wrote that hymn out of an experience she had in Switzerland, where she was invited, I think, to some kind of house party. And when she got there were 12 people, 2 of whom were Christians, the rest were not. 5 days later, when she left, all 12 were Christians. And she was so overwhelmed with joy at it that she wrote that hymn. It was her own reconsecration to God. And as you say, each stanza is an amazing stripping away of something she might have wanted to retain control over, but giving it all back to God. So great hymn for these times, I think.
Yeah.
It would be great, Pete. You have to send me those questions, and we'll put them up on like Facebook and Instagram, because I think there's a couple of people who have commented on them, and it'd be great to kind of share those for other people to think through and maybe do that in their communities. There was something I was thinking about, I can't remember where I read it, but it was this idea that kind of ministry, I don't know, the life of a Christian, when you think of Jesus, his time was interrupted a lot. He was never hurried, and a lot of the time, like spending time with people, it's not an efficient use of time, but it's kind of that living in community is what we're called to do, but it's not strategic or efficient. It's the way we're called to live. And it's again that the kind of wilding in that of letting go of our plans and trying to cram loads of stuff in our diary and just be present with those who are around us and in the places where we live as well. We've had so many good questions, and there's some really great ones that I would love us to talk about, but I was saying to the guys before, I'm really bad at timekeeping, so I'm going to really try, because this conversation is going to be an hour long, and this is just the beginning of a conversation. It's been great to have you all involved and kind of contributing, and we're so grateful for that, but it's just the beginning of something, I think. And there's a few different events coming up with the rural fresh expressions in particular. So there is a conference that Steve will be speaking at as well. I don't know if Pete, I've got a little this is my fancy look. The Rural and Wild Conference is next year. You need to put it in your diaries now. Could you just tell us a little bit about the conference that you got planned for next year? Sure.
It's at Swanwick, at the Hayes at Swanwick. It's at the dates that you've given, and we really felt as a team, the Rural Fresh Expressions FX Rural Guiding Team, that this is a really important thing for us to explore at this time, at this moment. And I think it still will be that moment. I don't think it will be too late for everybody, and many of us will need the courage to move on. So we're going to explore what it means to rewild the church, particularly in rural areas, together with some great folks like Steve and others, where we ask the questions and explore all the dimensions of it, really, as to how we can move on. Is that what you meant?
Brilliant. That's a great plug. Thank you, Pete. We've also got Rural Fresh Expressions are hosting an online learning community that starts on the 14th of September, and you can sign up. There should be a link in this broadcast, but there will be adverts going out as well over the next week or so, for anyone who's pioneering at the moment or maybe thinking about it, but in a rural, this is just for a rural context, and people like Pete and potentially Adam, I'm not sure, but I don't know if you're involved. I can't remember all the names, but there'll be fresh expressions practitioners guiding you through this idea of what what could be and what will be. And they're 3 sessions, and there's one in September, one in October, and one in November. So do sign up for those. Also, you can get in touch. You can get in touch with Fresh Expressions. Contact me, especially if this is for whatever reason. We have a website, or if it's for a rural kind of conversation, then get in touch with rural@freshexpressions.org. I've missed the UK off, .org.uk, and you can speak to the experts about the rural context, because something that's great about Fresh Expressions is it's a really contextual way of doing mission. And so rural effects are just one part of the movement. So thank you so much, Steve, Pete and Adam, for joining me in this conversation. It's been really, really challenging and really fruitful, I think. And thank you to everyone else that's joined us online and those people who listen later. Do like this and share it, and join in become part of Fresh Expressions. It's a great movement that is active and growing and moving and changing, and God's doing amazing things through people across the country and across the world through this way of doing church. So thank you very much, and we will see you soon. Goodbye.